Hey guys, welcome to part two of our LTC Speech 2021. In this video, we are going to talk about how to move from the outline of our text that we worked on in video one to developing our sermon based on that outline. So let's jump right in. Again, here is our passage that we're using for our sample sermon this year from Revelation chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. And here is the MAS, main idea, ask, and supporting points outline that we developed in video one. With our main idea, asking a question of that main idea, and then finding the answers to that question in the passage itself. And again, if you've got any questions on that, we covered that in video one. You can go back and see it there, or contact me, and I'll be glad to give you any guidance that you might need. But the important thing I want to remind us really quick is that the reason that this MAS outline is so important before we develop our sermon outline is that this ensures that our sermon keeps the biblical text as the core of what we want to say. More than ourselves, we want the Bible, we want God through Scripture to be the most prominent voice in our sermon. And so letting the text give us this outline, having an outline of the text, and using that outline for our sermon keeps God rather than us as the core voice of what we want to say. So a good sermon outline is easy to understand, it's easy to follow, and it's easy to remember. But in order for it to be simple, we usually have to put quite a bit of work into it to get it to that point. Let's talk about that in this video. A good sermon outline that we like to use in our speech, this is our sample outline. It is by no means the only outline, but it's a good one that we're going to use when we develop our sermons together. It's an introduction followed by a transition, the supporting or main points, and then a conclusion and a challenge to go with it. And so let's talk about for a moment, how do we move from that MAS outline to this sermon outline? Well, the main idea and the asking question both will find their place in the transition of our sermon. So the transition is a really important section that we're going to focus on today. And then our main points are, again, these are the answers that we find to that question in the text itself. Each of those becomes a main point of our lesson. In the introduction of our speech, we want to grab the audience's attention. We want to create interest. We want people to desire to hear what we have to say. In the transition, now that we've gotten their attention in the introduction, the transition is going to basically lead them with us to the Bible. Here's the text we want to look at. Here's the main idea of that text, and we're setting ourselves up to deliver the main points. And so in the transition, in addition to presenting the main idea of that text, we want to ask the question of it that the main points will be answering, so the audience can move with us. And we'll look at how to do that. And again, in the supporting points, they're, in addition to being the answers to the question that we've asked, we want to show support for the main idea. We want to always draw that line back to it. And then in our conclusion and challenge, we want to summarize our points, but also, just as important, we want to challenge or encourage our audience to do something, to think about something, to examine themselves, to really act on what they've heard today. So this is what our MAS outline might look in a sermon outline based on Revelation chapter 1. Again, you see that in our transition, we have our text, our main idea, and our asking question. We've got our support points, which are the answers to that question. Again, each of these comes from the text, and then our conclusion and challenge. So let's break each of these down, and starting with the introduction and the transition. For each one of these sections, we are going to talk about its key traits, and then give an example. What might that look like in a sample sermon based on this text? In the introduction, again, we want to create interest. We want people to really lean in and want to hear what we have to say. And we can do that a lot of times through telling a story. jumping right in with a dramatic, a historical, a funny story, maybe a rhetorical question, maybe some surprising facts or statistics. And we want to avoid things that will cause people, even without meaning to sort of tune us out. Things like a formal introduction, or giving away the topic too early, or an overused cliche like Webster's Dictionary, things like that. So again, and you can pause this and read through this. I won't read it to you in this video, but here is a good example of an introduction. Basically, it takes the Wizard of Oz movie and talks about when Toto pulls back the curtain and the great and powerful wizard is actually shown to be this mild-mannered, meek older man. And so again, so much for the great and powerful wizard. And so right there with this introduction, we've taken something that everybody is familiar with, this movie and this scene, and we've grabbed their attention by talking about it. And the transition now is key because it's going to take us from this story about the Wizard of Oz and move us to a biblical text. Let's talk about the transition. The transition is, again, a smooth move from the introduction to the biblical text. And in it, we want to include the text itself. This is where we can read it out loud, read it all the way through. We want to give the main idea of that text and then ask a question of it so that our main points will be answering that question. There's some great transition phrases to draw in between. Just like this in my introduction, so also we see this in Revelation 1. Or in the same way that the wizard is revealed in The Wizard of Oz, so God is revealed in Revelation 1. Things like that, drawing connections between one thing to something else. We want to avoid a bumpy or an unnatural transition of thought, something that just doesn't really make sense, and maybe the audience would have trouble, kind of following us along. We want to avoid long transitions that just take a long time to get through and then are real wordy. So again, a good transition example that we see here. Here's the last sentence of our introduction. And then we move into the transition where, sort of contrasting here. Instead of saying in the same way, we kind of say in the opposite way, where John's experience is very different from that of Dorothy. And again, you can pause this and read this transition here. Notice here's where we're going to read the text. Here's where we're going to ask the question of it. Who does God say he is? And so now each of my main points is answering that question. And here, sort of in question form, I've stated the main idea of that text. But these are the things we want to accomplish in our transition. So now let's go to our main points that are answering those questions. And again, notice that each of these is a question, is a statement from the text itself. And so we're just going to be elaborating on each one. We're going to take the first one and talk about how we might elaborate on that first point, that he is first and last. Again, they come from the passage. And for each point, we're going to develop it. We're going to give it some meat through things like explanation and elaboration, Bible illustration, a personal or other illustration, and then some application. Let's talk about each of those for a moment. How do we build on our point? I've got my point. He is first and last. Now, what else do I say about it? In our explanation and elaboration, as an audience member, help me clearly understand what you mean. But what do you mean when you say these things? Maybe I need to define some words. Maybe I need to restate it in another way. Maybe I need to read some other translations. And again, talk about the significance of it. Why is this point important? Why does it matter? But most of all, help me understand what you mean before we move on. Bible illustration. Where else might I see this point in Scripture? A personal or an other illustration. What does it look like for this? What's another way for me to think about this point in sort of an imagery? It looks like this played out in this way. Here's a funny story that sort of illustrates what I'm trying to talk about. And these illustrations are important because they can be some of the parts of our speech by nature of being an illustration. These can be parts of our speech that stay with people the longest and help them really understand and remember what we told them. And then some application. What is the significance for me in my everyday life? What does this point look like, and what should it mean, and how should it change and impact me based on what you've told me? We want to do some of these for each point. We don't have to do all of these for each of our points, but at least I would say 2 or 3 of them will be very helpful to build out those points. And so again, I've got an example here. Here is some explanation and elaboration and some Bible illustrations for the first point. So you can pause this and read through these. And then here is a real life illustration and an application for that first point. And again, you can pause and read through these as well. A few other things about those main points. You want to try to end with your strongest supporting point unless the text dictates otherwise. Sometimes the text will say things and they don't necessarily go in any order. And so if one of those points, as you develop your sermon, if you feel like one of those main points is your strongest and you're able to put it last, do that because you're kind of building to it. But sometimes the text will make some points and you can tell just by reading it and in your study that they build on each other. And so you kind of need to keep them in order. And if that's the case, keep them in order. You can use transition words to move from each point, first, second, third, as you're moving through. That helps your audience follow along. You might try, if you can, you might try to make your points relate to each other. If you're able to sort of reword or rephrase the points that you're making, as long as they still, say what the text is saying, maybe they start with the same letter or they have the same phrasing, sort of some parallel phrasing there. And that's helpful just so your audience can remember them better. Rather than 3 or 4 just totally different sentences, maybe make them relate to each other so that they're easier to remember as your audience walks out of the room. And again, we want to show at some point in each of these main points, we want to show how it relates back to the main idea of the text. We want to always draw that line back and talk about it. And then finally, our conclusion and the exhortation. Here, we want to restate our main idea, maybe in slightly different words. One thing that's helpful is to tie back to your introduction. You don't always have to do this, but it really helps bring your speech full circle. You want to summarize very briefly the supporting points, your main points that you made. And then you want to close with a final appeal to the audience to act on what you have preached that day, to do something with it. Maybe it's a challenge or a question or an encouragement that they can walk out with. And again, here is a conclusion example that you can pause and read through, but notice how it ties back to the introduction. Notice how it restates the main idea here in blue. Notice how it lists again our main points that we made, and then it ends with a challenge, an appeal to do something with what we've talked about. So you can pause this and read through this conclusion example. So again, one last time, here's the outline that we have on our text that moves into our sermon. I wish you guys all the best as you work on your speeches this year. I'm so sad that we can't meet in person, but I'm here to help if I can. You can call me, text me, email me, and I'll be glad to take a look at what you're working on and offer some guidance. But just know that I'm praying for you, and I know that God's going to speak through you in a mighty way at LTC this year. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know if I can help in any way.